Okay, great. So let's begin. So this is the Gemara on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So what we've been doing the last 5 or 6 shiurim is we've been analyzing um, what it is that makes certain cases off limits for Yibum. And in law, when you can identify the exceptions, often it is the basis for um, articulating the rule, itself. Because if you understand why, in rare cases something doesn't apply, then obviously, you are, revealing the inner character of a certain institution. So what we've been discussing is what is it that excludes the 15 cases of erva in the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph. What is it that establishes that in those cases, not only is there no yibum because you can't implement yibum, there's an obstacle to implementing yibum, but there's also no chalitza, and there's also a ptur tzara, meaning the co-wife is excluded as well. So what we've been trying to figure out is the relationship between two factors that usually apply to all 15 of those cases, and we're trying to isolate those factors in some additional cases as test cases to see more to understand more about this principle. So what the 15 cases have in common, the two different elements that stand out is number one, they are there's no heter gibum, meaning the legal obstacle, the halachic problem in implementing yibum is just too severe. Even though aseh is dochalos aseh, a positive commandment thrusts aside a negative commandment, but it doesn't thrust aside a lav sheish bakares, a prohibition, right, which is punishable by kares or more, means some sort of a capital offense. And therefore, all the 15 cases in the Mishnah are cases where the prohibition of the erva would preclude implementing yibum because of the chiyuv kares. At the same time, those 15 cases are excluded for another reason, and that is that, obstacle to implementation aside, there are all situations where the union between the yavam and the yavama, is inconceivable from a halachic point of view, from a stature and a status point of view. It's inconceivable that a man obviously would be, married to his daughter, or for that matter, to his wife's sister while she is alive, or to his mother-in-law. All that is inconceivable. And therefore, aside from the fact that in order to implement the mitzvah saseh yibum, you would be in violation of alav sheish bakares, and that would not be justified on the basis of the principle of aseh dochalos aseh. It's also true to say that these are relationship obstacles that cannot be overcome. So what we've been trying to explain is what happens if you have situations where you have one of these without the other. So, for example, we spent a few weeks on nida, because nida is chayve krisos, in the sense that if while she is a nida, if he were to have a physical relationship with her in order to trigger yibum, that would not be justified because it's einase dochalos aseh sheish bakares, even though nida is not the kind of status that would interfere with a union between people, because that's not what nida is. I mean, every husband and wife are in a situation of nida.
Starting with
So,
the assumption that all 15 have to be uniform, exactly the same reasons why they're forbidden.
they don't have to be, but they happen to be that both of these elements apply to all 15 cases. And not coincidentally, they're all chayve krisos or beyond. They're all ervas, which means they're all capital offenses. And in the case of the Mishnah, all the cases in the Mishnah are cases where the reason there's such a high, punishment is because of the impropriety, the illicitness of the relationship itself. They all happen to be cases where there's two a much of a kurva, so that it's a kind of an incestuous relationship.
But
Every
doesn't that
single one
beg
of
the
those cases,
question, since the whole Yibum itself is the same problem?
right? In Achanami, but the ibum is a very particular problem of Ashes.
In other words, why could there not be another exception to Yibum besides Yibum? Just like there was in the time of
Well,
Yehuda,
that's why the Gemara
just like
thought
in the
in the
time of Yehuda, that
Havamina,
was possible for a father-in-law, so to speak, to do Yibum. Why
right?
could we not say that there are other exceptions besides?
Well, that's what the Gemara weighed, and the Gemara rejected it by saying that it's ein aseh do chalos aseh sheish bakaris. But that the Gemara weighed that on Daf Gimel and Beis, and again on Daf Ches Samud Aleph. That was the Gemara's, discussion. But the Gemara concluded that Einase Dochalos Sheish Bakaris. The Rambam concluded from the same Gemara that the reason isn't Einase Dochalos Sheish Bakaris, it's that these are not subject to Tfisas Kiddushin, and they're not, the one case which by definition is Yibum, Lahalacha, which is Eshasach. And therefore, the Rambam says anything other than Eshasach, where there's no Tfisas Kiddushin, is going to be excluded from any kind of evil. So it's you're right. It could have. That's what the Gemara is on Gimel and Ches, and that's what they're all about. But the conclusion is that all these cases are excluded. And I'm just pointing out that they both share, and it isn't a coincidence. It's not like these things have nothing to do with each other. But what we've been trying to, accomplish in the last number of classes is to try to see situations like what will be, I'm just explaining what we've been doing. Rabbi Akiva held that, there's no tfisas kedushin in Chai Lavin either, even though it's not kares, it's only a lav. So there is aseh dakalos aseh, but it's still an illicit relationship that normally doesn't sustain a marriage. Nida is a case where you have the opposite. You have the kares part, but of course you can be mekadesh and nida. The kedushin will be chal. Ish, the case that we looked at, was a case where on the books she's not an Ish because it was a tanai. It was a situation where this woman was married and her first husband said to her, "I'm going to divorce you on condition that you not marry Shimon."
The Yibum that creates the Eshes.
Yeah, exactly. So, and as a candidate, there's actually no impediment. As an implementation, it's an impediment, a severe one. So these are the cases that we've been looking at. And then last week we discussed Tosas's view that there's also something called drachei darchei noam in halacha. I think what we tried to point out is that people have misused or abused this concept by applying it, against the halacha, but it is a concept that is applicable within the halacha. I'm just want to make sure this isn't. Let's see, sorry. Okay. And as such, since the question is when does it apply, when doesn't it apply? So, for example, in identifying the daled minim, like the Gemara says that you can't that a lulav, which is a certain type of lulav, which is thorny. In other words, if you were to pick it up, it would be very uncomfortable and you'd be bleeding. That can't be a lulav because of drachei hadarchei noam. And the Gemara says something similar about a certain type of hadassim, that there were certain type of hadassim that were very prickly.
Subject to halacha, would that be interpreted, so to speak, as civility?
No, it's more than civility. I would say, seemliness or something closer to that. So in those contexts, in the Gemara and Sukkah, the Gemara is applying drachei darchei noam in a biblical way. They're saying, can't be this, meaning other minim that qualify for daled minim, but they're excluded because they're the kind of object, that would be not more than uncomfortable, painful, so it's just very unique to find Drachad Darchino playing that kind of role. And what we saw in Yibum, which is why we're talking about it, is that the Gemara says on Pei Zayin Amud Beis that Mesim are Kechayim when it comes to Yibum. What that means is that if there was a child, that was alive at the time when his father passed away, even if that child subsequently died, right, we'd say Mesim Kechayim. As long as he was alive at the moment of the father's patira, so that the father left a child, even if that child, didn't survive, so we say Mesim Kechayim. There's no din of Yibum. So the Gemara wants to explain how can we say that there, but we don't say that, for example, when it comes to Trumos and Maestros and things. If a woman marries into a Kohen family, that she's a Bas Yisrael and she marries a Kohen, so she can eat Truma. And if her husband dies, so if she leaves if there's a child, then she can continue to eat Truma. But let's say, when he died, he left a child, and therefore she continues to eat truma. But then a month later, that child died. So the halacha is she can no longer eat truma. Now, we don't say mesim kechayim when it comes to truma. We say chayim rachayim. Those child's alive, he's alive.
So she can only have the truma because of the son? The son is a Kohen? She can only eat the truma through the son. Is that why she?
Well, she's not eating it so much through the sun, but as long as there's a sun, she still retains the strong kesher. Not eating because of the sun, but because there is a sun, there remains a living bond with the husband, and therefore she can eat truma. But point is that it's not frozen one way or another at the time that the husband dies. It's dependent on whether or not the son continues to be alive. So if at the time when he died there was a son, so she would continue eating truma, and then let's say
right. I mean, basically, I don't know. Her ticket to truma is through the son. As long as the son is alive, she can eat truma. Once he dies,
you're saying it in a misleading. Also. You're saying it.
Why is it misleading? It's factual.
It's
only rights to truma is because the son is alive. Once he dies, also. She can't do it.
No, yeah, but she doesn't eat because
maybe you don't like the way I'm saying it. Those are the facts.
Right, but when I don't like the way you're saying it, not aesthetically, legally, it's wrong. I'll explain to you why it's legally wrong. It's correct only in a narrow way. Why is it legally wrong? Two reasons. Number one, the reason she eats truma when she marries a Kohen, I don't want to get too involved in this, is because she's kinyan kaspo, because she's the wife. There's no din that the mother of a Kohen eats truma. There's a din that the wife of a Kohen eats truma. And the difference is also very simple, and that is, let's say she marries a Yisrael. She would say she married a Kohen, she had a child, the Kohen died, she continues to eat truma. But then now she married a Levi, so she can no longer eat truma, even though her son is a Kohen. Because even though the remnant of her husband's of her marriage to the Kohen husband through the son is live, there's a stronger bond in terms of her being kinyan kaspo to her new husband. So if her new husband is a Levi or her new husband is a Yisrael, even if she has a child who's a Kohen, she still won't be able to eat truma. Whereas if what you were saying was legal.
Right, okay, so I left out the part about if she remarries, she loses, meaning
right, you didn't just leave that again.
Ticket as long as she doesn't
I'm not trying to make you feel badly, but it's not just leaving it out. I mean, that's why it's legally what you said is true in many cases, but it's not the legal it's not the right legal definition for that reason. Because it isn't about the son. The son is a way.
It's about the son if he doesn't remarry.
No, it's about the son as a continued connection to the father. And therefore, if there's a connection, to a substitute for the father, namely through another marriage, then that, overrides the connection to the previous marriage. Had it been a din, and it could have been, just that it isn't, Had it been a din that the mother of a Kohen eats truma, betoras, the mother of a Kohen, meaning because of her son directly, then it wouldn't matter to us, frankly, whether or not.
She remarries.
And I would also add that, let's say there was I'll give you another example. Let's say she wasn't married to a Kohen, but she had a child with a Kohen, right? So let's say the child would be a Kohen. She wouldn't eat truma. She only eats truma if she's the wife of a Kohen.
Oh, interesting. What about the sister in that case? Meaning,
sister?
Does the sister get rights?
Which sister?
Meaning, let's say there was a daughter.
You mean in general, case. Bas Kohen?
Yeah, but Bas Kohen, but the father died. The father died.
Yes, a Bas Kohen who never got married can eat truma.
No, he means
forever. She's like a son.
A daughter.
Yeah, unless she marries. Once she marries, then she's.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. So, anyways, but the point, the bigger point in terms of Yibum is that we make this distinction that when it comes to Yibum, we say Mesim Kachayim. We don't care whether the child is currently alive. We care that the child was alive at the time, at the critical moment of the death of the father. That's for Yibum. And therefore, if the child dies later, there's still not going to be any Yibum because there was a child at the moment when he passed away. But when it comes to Trumos and Maestros and so on, it actually depends on, not Mesim Kachayim, but whether the child is alive or the child is not alive. So what the Gemara says is the reason why Yibum is different is because of Drachal Darchei Noah. So that's a very remarkable idea because it's a pasuk in Mishlei, and again, this is a din d'oraisa. This question whether or not the presence of a child negates Yibum or not is a biblical issue, not a rabbinic issue. So it's not a policy question; it's a definitional question. So the idea that a pasuk in Mishlei, which says Drachal Darchei Noah, it doesn't speak about this case. It speaks about, in general, the idea that the Torah's ways are peaceful and seemly and and appropriate and pleasant. So that would determine this question is quite remarkable, and that's why it's a remarkable Gemara. So the Balei Tosas understood that it isn't just that one case, but that is the paradigm. Even though the Gemara doesn't say these words there, for the principle of Nasra, that's what we were discussing. The idea of Nasra is the idea that if there's a fundamental obstacle to Yibum at the moment when the mace dies, if at that moment there's a good reason why you can't go ahead with Yibum, for example, let's say the Yavam was married to the sister of the Yavama at that time, right? I mean, two brothers married two sisters. So when one brother died, the other brother was married to the other sister, and therefore there could be no Yibum. So that's what the Gemara says, that even if the wife of the Yavam dies afterwards, it's still too late because of the principle of Nasra. So the Balei Tosas say, no, Nasra, the third answer of Tosas on the question of he does, that Nasra is based on the principle of Drachal Darchei Noah. Meaning, just like, being in limbo, when there's a child and you're not sure if the child's going to, what's going to happen to the child going forward. What are you going to say? He left the child, so there's no din yibum. And then an accident took place and something happened to the child, so now you open up yibum again. So she'll be an aguna, or she'll be psychologically, in some sort of ambiguous, situation, never knowing whether she is free and clear of or subject to yibum. That's a problem of Drachal Darchei Noah. So Tosa says that's the source, even though the Gemara doesn't say it. That's Nasra. This is just another, way of saying Nasra, meaning everything needs to be clarified at the moment of the Misa. You can't have, a situation where there's limbo or ambiguity And then later on, depending on what happens later, a child lives, a child dies. In this case, the sister who he was, initially married to, she dies or she survives. You can't, have, such contingent.
How come we don't seem to be so concerned about that by something like miyun, which could lead to all kinds of
Well, miyun is a din d'Rabbanan. Miyun is
even more so. How can Rabbanim transgress?
Right, because they also wanted to
And that's
protect
what-
Katan. That's a din d'Rabbanan. But
Andy, raise your volume, Andy.
what?
Andy, raise the volume. We cannot hear you.
Huh?
Raise your volume.
Raise
Oh, I
the-
think he wants you to increase your volume. It's hard
Yeah.
to
Okay.
Cannot hear
Do
you.
the best I can.
see. That's a
There
compliment.
it goes.
Usually they want you to mute. He wants you to
The Rabbanan in particular would
Yeah.
have, would have no problem applying Mishlei, to what they
Right.
do.
Well, it's easier to apply Rabbanan, and then you can have policy questions one way or another. But my point is that the pasuk in Mishlei wasn't said about any of these specific cases. It's a general rule about, it's a statement about the Torah. So it's just very curious. Anyway, Tosas expands it. The Rambam does not. The Rambam never mentions Drachel Darchei Noam, even in the case of Mesim Kechayim. The Rambam agrees with the halacha of Mesim Kechayim, but he does not invoke Drachel Darchei Noam, which I think is very interesting. Rashi, doesn't expand it, but the Balitosis, and then after the Chachmei Svarad, who were so influenced by the Balito, the Ramban, the Rajba, the Ritva, the Ra, the Meiri, in Provence, they started expanding Drachel Darchei Noam, being very like a big player in Yibam. So the point I think I didn't get a chance to say enough last time, but I want to leave you with before we move on to the next topic is the following. I think I did read the Tshuva of the Radvaz, didn't I, right, last week? Which I was trying to show that there are other cases where even in very fundamental halachos, some Bali halacha quote Darchei Noam, but it's never against the halacha. It's always when there's a vacuum, when there's a gray area. For example, last week I read the Tshuva of the Radvaz, where somebody was, forced. They wanted to force someone to sacrifice his own limb in order to save the life of another. In other words, let me cut off your hand, right, to save the life of another person. Somebody pointed out to me, it's correct. It's a very big issue. The truth is that's a case of anos, but you have the case of choli, you have it a lot. Like somebody says, somebody needs a kidney transplant. Right? I don't want to get into the details of this right now, but it's a topic we should do one time. And that is, most people can live with one kidney, but certainly,
People are born
giving
with
up a
one
kidney
and they live all their life.
is a serious, obviously, is a very serious commitment, and there's a shortage of those organs, as we know. So it's a remarkable chesed for a person to decide to give up, one of his kidneys so that somebody else can survive and even thrive. And in a way, that's this discussion of the Radvaz. What the Radvaz says is that is a person who does that when it's not a sakana exactly, it's less than a sakana, but it's still an immense sacrifice. Says the Radvaz, that person is a chassid, meaning what he's doing is lifnim b'shur sadin, and he's to be complimented for his extraordinary chesed. But the Radvaz, others disagree, but the Radvaz says he's not obligated to do that, because to obligate someone to give up, their own more complete health or an aver, even to save someone else's life, the Torah wouldn't put somebody in that situation where he was forced to do that. And he quotes Drachel Darchei Noam. Anyways, the takeaway point that I want to make is as follows. Why is that in Shas, in the Gemara, and the Talmud, at least according to Balitosis, for sure, and even without the Balitosis, but especially with the Balitosis, that Drachel Darchei Noam, all of a sudden in the area of Yibum, it plays such a big role. And why is it that in the Daled Minim, when it comes to the Minim that you take on Sukkos, there too, all of a sudden, even on a biblical level, we're saying Drachel Darchei Noam. We don't say it mostly in other contexts.
Yibum, I think you answered the question. It's a common theme that you've been pushing. It's the fact that since Yibum is so dangerous, so to speak, so contrary to what we would expect in our behavior, that it has to be totally 100%.
Exactly. So that is exactly what I'm trying to say. And another example of that. Um, I think the more we find it, the more important it is, and then really reinforce it. So that exactly what I wanted to bring out with this, and that is that the Yibum, we're already like treading, on the a very careful line, between demanding a lot of the parties, in terms of sensibility. You have somebody who is your brother-in-law or he's a sister-in-law, and therefore, that's a very different, supposed to be a very different kind of relationship, and it would be a huge, egregious breach, all things being equal, to cross those lines, and yet, in the case of Lahakim Lachiv Shem B'Yisrael, it's not only permissible, but it is a huge mitzvah. And I've been arguing all year for the same reason, and that's why you have to walk the line even more carefully, because the very reason why it's a betrayal is the reason why, when it's done sincerely for your brother, not against your brother, not as a betrayal, but as a way of ensuring his legacy. So it's like two sides of the same coin. But but the whole point is that you're treading, on dynamite here. And that's what we've been seeing again and again and again. And therefore, you have to really, protect the parties in order to accomplish this. So part of that protection, I believe, is an inflated l'tova, a properly inflated perspective on drachei darchei noam v'chol nesivoseh shalom. Meaning, if you're going to start, saying, there's a child, but if something happens later before she remarries, then you're going to open up Yibum again. You just can't play with Yibum in that way, with the emotions and with the distance, and the accommodation psychologically to it. You just can't do that. So
Is
that's why I
is that
believe.
the reason, or it's just not right to do that?
Well, it's not right.
It's not about the emotions. I thought it's more about, like, I mean, it's making it sound like it's psychological thing. It's nothing to do with psychological. It has to do with, maybe
I think it's
a
both.
riot. A riot.
Drachei Darchei Noam has some element of causing people to wait. There being a gray area where their fate is not determined.
Like Iguna, like you have no
Yeah,
no set direction.
yeah. So again, it's a halachic thing for sure. It isn't just pop psychology. But
Yeah, that's
what I'm
what I meant.
pointing out is that the sensitivities here are very acute to begin with. What about Daled Minim? That's the other one where the Gemara, at least, is very upfront about it on a Doraisa level. So there, I think also there's a very simple reason, and that is the Torah uses, an expression about Daled Minim that it rarely uses, and that is Usmachtem. Usmachtem Fnei Hashem Elokechem, the psukim that we read in Parshas Emor a couple of weeks ago. It's Lekachtem Lachem B'Yom Harishon Tzadar Kapos Tamarim Anafei Tzavos V'Arvei Nachal, and do smachtem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem shivas yamim. So it's rare to find that the goal or the character of a mitzvah is usmachtem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem, and it's rare for a mitzvah. All mitzvahs are subject to the principle of what we call zekeli vanveyu. His snoah lefanav b'mitzvos, that you're supposed to have an aesthetic sensibility, when it comes nice tefillin, a beautiful sefer Torah, and so on and so forth. Every mitzvah, a nice shofar, his snor lefanav b'mitzvos, meaning there's an aesthetic element to the performance of mitzvos. It shows, a certain appreciation. Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu l'zakos, es Yisrael lefika kirbalam Torah mitzvos. So the idea of, Zekeli Vanveo Lekei Aviva Romameno, the drasha that we have, which is his snor, the fun of a mitzvah, applies across the board. However, when it comes to Daled Minim, where it says Usmaktim Fnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim, and where one of the primary vehicles is the esrog, which is called pre-eitz hadar, and therefore, there's a standard called hadar, which is ma'akev. I mean, there's a very famous, exchange between Rashi and Tosos in the beginning of the third parak of Sukkah. The Mishnah says that lulav hayavesh is pasul. A dried out lulav is pasul. So Rashi says, why is it pasul? Because zekeli vanveyu. Because the pasuk in Shira says, and we understand his snor lefanav mitzvos. When you do a mitzvah, you should do it in an aesthetically pleasing way. And if you use a dried up lulav, that's obviously not aesthetically pleasing. So the Balitosis jump on this, and they say two things. Number one, they say the Gemara gives a different explanation. It doesn't quote Zakeli Van Meyu. It quotes pre-eitz hadar, even though that doesn't refer only to the lulav, mostly it refers to the esrog. But we say hadar be'inan veleka. So that's a seemingly different source, number one. Number two, they say hisnor lefana b'mitzvos, Zakeli Van Meyu, is a universal idea in all mitzvos, but it's typically not ma'akev. Mostly, it's a preference that you should have, a nice talis, nice tefillin, a beautiful shofar, a nice sukkah, and so on and so forth. But it's not ma'akev. And here we're saying that a lulav hayavesh, which Rashi says is connected to zakeli vanveyu, that it's ma'akev. What's going on? But I think the answer is very simple, and that is that the fact that there's a din of hadar kind of bumps up zakeli vanveyu. We say in all other mitzvos it's zakeli vanveyu, and here there's an added element, and that is hadar. But if it wasn't for the regular zakeli vanveyu, then we wouldn't bump it up higher to hadar. But the idea is that the daled minim, because it is the level of aesthetic enjoyment is of greater significance than in other mitzvos, and because this is all part of the joy of usmachtem fnei Hashem Elokechem shivas yamim. So we're more acutely sensitive to breaches of zakeli vanveyu. That's what Rashi is explaining. He's not arguing that this, with the Gemara that says hadar. He's not arguing that typically zakeli is only lechatchila. What he's saying is, in the case of daled minim, usmachtem of Hashem Elokechem, we're more sensitive. So I said that this is my own speculation, I have to admit, but I think it's not a coincidence that the Gemara uses zakeli. I'm sorry, drachel darchei noam b'chol nesivasecha shalom. In this outsized way, not only in Yibum, in our Gemara, but also in Gemara and Sukkah for the daled minim. The idea that you would be obligated to take, or you would fulfill the mitzvah of, of lulav or of hadas, with a min, that, leaves literally blood on your hands. You're taking this min and it's usmachtem fnei Hashem Elokechem, and it has thorns in it. So they thought that was a biblical law, that you can't do that, because here we're dealing with like one higher level up of usmachtem fnei Hashem Elokechem. Anyways, so that is what we were discussing. So now I want to turn these are all issues connected with this broader topic of is there yibum, what's the relationship between about issues of yibum when there's a relationship problem? What's the issue of yibum when there is a implementation problem? So now I want to turn our attention, it's a little late already, but let's move to the next point, and that is to the Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So in the new Mar Makomos, there are new Mar Makomos, and it's called Binan Yibum Besoto Machzir Grushaso. So we're going to start with that Gemara, and if you have a Shas Gemara, it's on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph 11a. So the Gemara says in the Gemara, it's about 2/3 of the way down the page. We've seen this Gemara before, actually, because it was quoted also on Daf Gimel Amud Beis earlier in the year. So the Gemara says as follows: Omer Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Sora Sota Asura, Tu Maksiv Ba Karayos. So this is very interesting issue. What is a sota? So firstly, let me explain that there are two types of sota. Right, a sota is a woman who betrays, her husband, and the marriage vows, of her marriage. There are two situations in the halacha. One of them is what's called sota vadai, and that's certainly what we're speaking about in this Gemara. Sota vadai means that we know for certain that this woman has betrayed her husband. In other words, that she had.
There's a continuum of betrayal. She was secluded with somebody, but we don't.
No. That's the sota safek. We'll get that in a second. That's exactly what I want to contrast. A sota vadai is when we know for certain there was no kinui, there was no stira. There might have been, but you don't need that. We know for certain that she, had a relationship outside of her marriage. That's called sota vadai. With two Adam. Two Adam know this for a fact. That's sota vadai.
Well, for that, you don't need the whole sota process that we see in the Torah.
Correct. So that's what's called a sota vadai. If you look at Rashi, that's what Rashi's talking about. Rashi says, Tzara sota asura. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Hayan nasui beis nashim. If he was married to two different women, let's say, again, in the olden days, let's say Ruvain had two wives. He had a wife named Sarah and a wife named Esther. Okay, so he had a wife named Sarah, and a wife named, we'll do it the other way. He had a wife named Esther and a wife named Sarah. You'll see why in a second. Okay? V'zinsa ha'achas tachtav v'yeshedim. And let's say Esther, right, one of his wives, betrayed the marriage. She had an affair. She had a relationship with a man outside of her marriage. V'yeshedim, and there is evidence of this, right? No kinui, no stira, but worse, we know for certain that she betrayed her marriage vows. So then what happens? Umes, then Ruvain dies, right? Below Banim, he doesn't have any children, and he leaves these two wives behind, Esther, who betrayed him, and Sarah, who was a good, loyal wife. So let's say Esther is the wife that we're zeroing in on. She's the sota, and Sarah is the tzara. That's why I picked Sarah to be the tzara. Sarah is the co-wife. She didn't do anything wrong. So the din is he, meaning Esther, the one who betrayed the marriage, Vitsarasa and Sarah, her co-wife, who was perfectly innocent in everything, both of them pturos af min chalitza. They're both exempt even from chalitza and certainly from yibum. My taima, why? So the Gemara says, Tuma ksivbe v'nistera v'hi nitmaha. As it says in the pasuk, v'nistera. We'll get to that in a minute. I know you're going to ask me about stira, so we'll get to that in just a second. V'nistera v'hi nitmaha karayos. So go back to the Gemara for a moment. That's the case. Rav Omar Rav Yunam Rav Tsaras Sota, the co-wife of a woman who betrayed her husband, let's say Sarah, right, who was the co-wife with Esther. Esther was a sota. And now Sarah and Esther are noflos liyibum to Shimon, the brother of Reuven, right? The din is asura. Both of these wives, not only Esther, the betrayer, but even Sarah, the innocent, loyal wife, who's only a tzara here, both of them are excluded from Yibum. Why? Tuma ksiv be karayos.
Wasn't there a husband?
What does it mean, tuma ksiv be karayos? One more second. Because in the parsha of Sota, it uses the word tuma, right? Which is v'nistra v'hi nitma. And in the parsha of Arayos and Achremos, it says about all the Arayos that they're tuma. So even though, let's make it clear, Sota is not included in parsha of Achremos or Kedoshim, right? Nonetheless, this connection to the term tuma binds Sota with the Arayos, with respect specifically to excluding Yibum and Chalitza, not only for her, but for the co-wife, for the Tzara as well, meaning to treat her like we treat Arayos, which is to exclude everybody from Yibum and Chalitza. That is the halacha. Now, why is this so mechudash? So we'll see in a moment. Yeah, did you have a question?
Well, isn't there an obligation upon the husband when this happens to separate and divorce his wife under these circumstances? So
Well, he's not allowed to live with her. And therefore the proper
he's really supposed to divorce her. I know we can't force him to divorce her, but he's supposed to divorce her.
So we're talking about a situation where, either he didn't yet,
No,
or
but shouldn't that change the Zika, basically? She's out of the
you
picture.
would only change the Zika if there was. Well, that's the question, really. I mean, but the divorce, if there was a divorce, there would be no Zika, of course, right? But we're talking about a situation where there was no divorce.
Sorry, you have to be at the same level. The two people, the two parties, basically. That's what makes them a tzara. Okay. So my point is that this woman is out of the marriage. He can no longer, halachically, he's no longer supposed to keep.
Oh, you want to ask that she should not be a tzara?
Yes.
I hear. But legally and formally, no divorce yet took place, even though they're not allowed to continue to live together. So
but
it's
a breakup in that twin aspect that makes her a tzara. The tzaras are sort of twins in the fact that they both have the common denominator with the husband.
It's an interesting idea. But obviously the Gemara here thinks that it's not so. I mean, at least it's not so in this application, but it's an interesting idea. Okay. Now, what is unique about this? So let me take a step back for a moment. Let me just spell it out first, and then I'll take the step back. So again, we've been looking for cases. We're saying tumak sivbo karayas, but it isn't in the parsha of Achrimos, right? Or Kedoshim. Moreover, what is the punishment if he continues? Let's say he didn't divorce his wife, and let's say he continued to live with her after after it's known that she's a sota. So he violates a lav. They violate a lav of sota. Is there any kares? No. There's no kares. Is there tfisas kiddushin? Well, let's start with that. There's no kares.
Well, are the children mamzerim if they have children?
One sec. No mamzerus. We'll see in a moment. Look at the Gemara on Mem. Let's turn to the Gemara for a moment on Mem Tes Somad Aleph, a Gemara that we've seen already. Right? We've been jumping through this Masechta for most of the year, so we've actually seen many more pages than you might imagine. This is one that we've seen a few times. The bottom line on Mem Tes Somad Aleph says, Amar Abaya, everybody have it? Mem Tes Somad Aleph, the bottom line, last line. Amar Abaya, Hakol Modim, Bibal Anida, everybody agrees, Bibal Anida, that if he were to have an improper relationship or relations with Anida, right? Vi al hasota, or with a sota, equating them, she'ein avlad mamzer, that the child that was produced from such an illicit act, right, it's usher. They're not allowed to have an intimate relationship at this point, not a sota, not a nida. However, in both cases, there would be no mamzerus.
Even according to Rabbi Kiva?
Possibly even according to Rabbi Kiva, that's a machlokus between Rashi and Tosfos, actually. If you look at down on the page, there's some massive Tosfos in. That's a discussion between Rashi and Tosfos. Okay, so let's leave Rabbi Kiva out of it for the moment. And then the Gemara explains, Nida da tafsi b'kiddushin, shenemar ti nidasa alav, afilu b'shas nidasa tafsi b'kiddushin, sotanami da tafsi b'kiddushin. Okay, Tanya Namahachi, again, another brisa, akomodim b'bal anida v'ala sota, v'al, another one, shomeres yavam, she'en avlad mamzer. V'abaya, shomeres yavam mesapkale ikarav. When it comes to Shomer Yavam, it's trickier. They're not so certain about it. Okay. The point is, on the one hand, we say Tumas Ke'erva, and we're saying that there's an exclusion of Tzara, which is very far-reaching. And according to Rashi, and we'll see in a moment Tosas as well, there's an exclusion even of chalitza. There's no chalitza either. We'll see that this is also the view of the Ramban and the Rambam, but the Ravid, quoted by the Ramban, disagrees. The Ravid is of the opinion that there is chalitza in this case.
Doesn't
And
he
the
hold-
Ra'ah says something
Right,
even
hold
more
that where
sensational.
There can't be Yibum, there can't be Chalitza.
Right. So it's there are a few exceptions to that rule. This is going to be one of them. But that's a great point, but that's absolutely true. We'll get back to that. But according to the simple, let's keep it Rashi Tosas for the moment and Rambam and so on. So what we're saying is Tumah is Ke'erva, and there's a din of Tzara. Wow. Right? And there's no Chalitza. Right? Inase dochav lo sase v'yaseh. Right? If you have like an almana nesua, a kohen gadol, in a yibum situation, in other words, this woman was married, to a kohen gadol's brother, and she died, and they were, Erison and Nesuin, and then no one did anything wrong. He died, and the brother is the kohen gadol. So that's the Gemara Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. The Gemara says that the Mishnah and the Gemara says that an almana, the kohen gadol, nesua is a violation of an asay and a lav, and ein asay dochalos asay v'asay. You can't proceed with the yibum, right? Under those conditions, you can't proceed with it. If it was only a lav, you'd say asay dochalos asay. But you do need chalitza. Almana the kohen gadol needs chalitza, and there's no din of tzara. If there's an almana nesua, the kohen gadol, and she has a co-wife who, whatever, something like that, there's no din of tzara, and there's no din of ptur chalitza. In Sota, we're saying something very mechudash based on the psukim of erva, tuma ke'erva. We're saying that there's no chalitza, according to Rashi and Tosas and the Rambam and the Ramban. There's no chalitza. So it's worse, we're saying, than aseh v'lav. When in fact, you'd think it'd be better because it's just a lav. It's not even a lav and an aseh. Why do you say aseh dochalos aseh here? So not only do we not say aseh dochalos aseh and you could be miyabim, we say there's no chalitza, and we say in addition to that the co-wife is excluded because of tuma ke'erva. It's breaking all the rules. It's not an erva, actually. It's not in the parsha. There's no kares. But there's even a bigger problem here, or a bigger issue here, and maybe that's the answer. And that is, you alluded to it before, but let's bring it out. All the cases that we've been dealing with till now are cases where the problem is between the Yavam and the Yavama. I mean, we're contemplating whether after the brother dies, there can be a new marriage, a new relationship between, his brother and her and his brother's wife, or one of his brother's wives, correct? The Yavam and the Yavama. So what we're saying is if the Yavama is one of the 15 arayoses of the Mishnah, then she cannot, create a marriage with the Yavam, right? Or if we're talking about, let's say, Almana Nesua L'Kohen Gadol or a Grusha L'Kohen Hedger, what are we talking about? We're talking about Chayve Lavin or Chayve Lavin V'yaseh. We're talking about impediments. We're weighing impediments to what? To a union, a marriage between the Yavam and the Yavama, where the problem stems from the relationship between the Yavam and the Yavama, right? Is that what's happening in Sota? No, in Sota, the opposite is happening. In the cases of the Mishnah and all the cases we've been dealing with till now, almost, right? There was no problem in the original marriage. The original marriage was fine. What's the problem? When you want to take, let's say, Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and Reuven marries Shimon's daughter, which is legal. He can marry his niece. 1 second. So he marries his niece, right? Was that a problem? No, they had a good marriage. I don't know whether I'd recommend it, but that's something else, right? They were married. There was no problem. Then he dies. The problem is that Shimon can't be miyabim his daughter. That would be, the heights of improper incest. You can't do that. So the problem is a problem in the second marriage, not in the first marriage. What's the problem of sota? Problem of sota is not a problem in the second marriage per se. Or if it is, it's only because of the first marriage. What's the problem? Because she's in violation of sota, right?
Wouldn't that be similar to
One second. That's a problem between her and her husband. That's not a problem between her and her. For example, can she marry someone else? She's not allowed to marry her husband. She can now also not allowed to marry the person who she violated her marriage vows with.
Or
It says echad lebal v'echad leboel. Whatever that's a very interesting halakha. It's not for now, but echad lebal v'echad leboel. Right? We don't allow the the person into the interloper in the marriage. We don't allow him to marry her either. But assuming she isn't getting the death penalty for violating, let's say she didn't get asra, whatever it is, she's going on with her life. Let's say, can she marry someone else? Could she marry a third party? Let's say she does tshuva or she doesn't do tshuva. Either way, somebody else marries her. Is there any iser? No. She can marry someone else. So the problem of sota here and tuma ke'erva is very extraordinary because the iser is between the yavama and the mace for the first time, not the yavama and the yava. The yavama and the yavam have no problem except as a derivative of the problem that existed between the mace and the yavama. There's one other example of this, and that's in the next Gemara, and that's Machzor Grushaso. What is Machzor Grushaso? So we'll remember from last year, we have it here also this year. That's the next Gemara, Yud Aleph Amud Beis. We're not to there yet, but let's talk about the case for a minute. The case of Machzor Grushaso is Reuven was married to Sarah, right? They got divorced. Nobody did anything terrible. They just, whatever it is, they got divorced, whatever. Then she remarried, right? If she hadn't remarried and he wasn't a Kohen, they could try again. But she did remarry. So therefore, even if he's not a Kohen, there's an Isser called Machzor Grushaso. He's not allowed to, they're not allowed to remarry after she was married to someone else in between. Let's say they do it. Let's say they're he's Mekadesh and against the halacha. He's not allowed to, but let's say he did it. Is the Kiddushin?
Well, what are the status of those kids? More importantly,
it should have.
The answer is there is Tfisas Kiddushin.
It has Tfisas Kiddushin.
And the kids don't have a status, right? The kids. What happens if they have kids?
Well, there's no mamzerus because either way it's not chayve krisis. There, Rabbi Akiva, that's one of the cases Rabbi Akiva says that there is. For Rabbi Akiva, there's mamzerus. That's the mission on Dalit and Aleph. But there is Tfisas Kiddushin. Even in Sota, take it this way. Let's take it in Sota. It's the Gemara that we just read. The Gemara says Hakomodim benido besota that is no mamzerus. Because but if it also says it because if he was Mekadesh, the Kedusha would be Chal. What's the case? Let's say he divorces her because she's a Sota, and he's supposed to divorce her, right? And then he changed his mind and he decided he was Mekadesh her again. Is the Kedushin Tofes? Even though it's Asur, and they're not allowed to live together, is the Kedushin Tofes? Yes, because she's not an Erva and she's not Chayve Krisos.
So it's the same as the Machzor Grushaso.
Yeah. I mean, Sotamag, we'll see. They share the same pasuk.
Actually, a better question. I'm not so sure he did anything wrong. The Torah says he must divorce her. Where does it say he can't remarry her?
Well, they can't live together.
So he did the right thing to divorce her. Now, who says he can't?
The Torah didn't say divorce her. The Torah said.
What do you mean? If the Torah says divorce her, Andy, that means you can't remarry her. What kind of games you play?
Again,
he's not allowed to remarry.
Come on.
But he did the Kiddushin would be Chal because it's Tfisas Kiddushin. So what I'm trying to show here is that the din of this Gemara, is unusual from so many points of view. On the one hand, the Gemara seems to be upping the problem status of Sota as if it's an erva, right? Which it isn't. It's not really an erva because it's not in Parshas Arayos. There's no kares. There is Tfisas Kiddushin. There's no mamzerus. But in addition to all that, all the problems of erva that we've been speaking about are problems in trying to connect, to create a union between the Yavam and the Yavama.
You definitely have a very
Here, the problem is the Yavam and Yavama's problem isn't their own problem. It's the problem of the soured relationship that she had both in Machzor Groshoso and in Sota with her husband, which on the surface,
on steroids.
No one said, when they say Deracha Darchei Noam, it's very mechudash, but we're not looking to expand it even more.
I understand.
But okay. So the Tuma Ke'ervas, I'll just give you another example just to highlight it, and then we'll see what Tosa says about all this also, which is the following. Last week, or I think it was last week, when we were talking about Nida, right? I mentioned the big machlokas between the Rambam and Balei Tosas, whether or not Nida is an erva, right? And one of the things I mentioned is that the Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah Reish Tzadi Hey, Reish Tzadi Vav, discusses whether the din of Yehoreg Val Yavor, which applies to Arayos, does that apply to Nida or not?
But just to be clear, I remember we discussed it, but how can Nida be, erva is a permanent thing. Nida is a temporary.
Well,
I understand. No. The question is, she becomes an erva every 2 weeks. I mean, it's all crazy.
Well, certainly the Gemara describes the relations between them as Gilui Arayos when she's a Nida. What you're pointing out, which is something I was trying to emphasize, which is there might be a difference between describing the act as Gilui Arayos and describing the person, the Gavra, as an erva, because one speaks about the relationship. There's no relationship problem, but there is an action problem. But the language erva and the parsha of erva and the language of erva both of these are connected to Nida.
Well, let me ask a different question. If someone has bia with a Nida, what's the status of that child?
Well, that's what we were saying before. There is no mamzerus. It's an exception. There is tfisas kiddushin benida, and there's no mamzerus bekiddushin benida. In that sense, it's an exception. But the way the Rambam describes the
so there was no penalty for the kids.
Right. Well, it might be pogrom,
that proves it's not an erva.
Yeah.
That proves
the way that the Rambam describes that, this is what we talked about last week. And like some of the Balei Tosas say, you see from there, it isn't really an erva, like what you're saying. But the way the Rambam describes it is, Rambam says, Afal pi shenida erva hi. Nonetheless, it's an exception when it comes to mamzer. That's Perik Dalid Hilchos Yisur Bia, and it's an exception when it comes to Tfisas Kiddushin. That's Perik Dalid Hilchos Ishus Halacha Yud Beis. But so the Minchas Chinuch says, listen, let's say somebody holds a gun to your head, to somebody's head, and he says, I'm going to kill you unless you do this act. Okay. Is that Gilui Arayos? Is Nida an erva with respect to the din of the Gimel Averos of Rotzeah?
That's a good question.
That's a Minchas Chinuch's discussion. So the Minchas Chinuch says, I think it's actually I'm not the Minchas Chinuch. Me personally, I think it's clearly depends on the Rambam and Tosis and so on. But the Minchas Chinuch says, quotes the Rambam, and he says the Rambam always calls it erva. Probably it's Yehareg Vayavor. That's his view. But then the Minchas Chinuch goes on to make the following comment. Minchas Chinuch says, what about, is there Yehareg Vayavor for Sota and for Shomeres Yavam? Right? After all, there's no Chayve Krisos. There is Tfisas Kiddushin. There's no Mamzerus. right? There's not even kares. On the other hand, he says the Gemara in Yevamos, the one that we're learning right now on Yud Aleph Hamad Aleph, says that there's a hafkas tzara and there's no chalitza because of tuma ke'erva. So the Gemara in Yevamos Yud Aleph Hamad Aleph calls it an erva and treats it as an erva legabe dine yibum, even though in all other respects it's different than yibum. So what about Yeharik Val Yavor? That's the Minchas Chinuch's question. A very interesting question. So in a way, Nida, right, and Sota, which have something in common, but in a way they're opposites of each other, right? So Nida is in the Parsha of Achrei Mos, but maybe it's not really an erva, right? And Sota is not in Parsha Achrei Mos, and it's never called an erva explicitly, but maybe Tuma Ke'erva, it's treated like an erva. So the Minchas Chinuch is really not sure about it. So I would just add to the mix, that in addition to the fact that Sota is not an erva and it's not a capital offense and so on, is when it comes to Yibum, just repeating what I said a second ago, Yibum, the problem of Sota and Maksud Grashaso is a totally different kind of a problem, because it's not an obstacle, or the only reason it's an obstacle for the Yavam and Yavama is because first it's an obstacle between the mace, or the Baal, if you want to call it, and his wife. But that's not true of all the other cases of Erva. All the other cases, the Ervas between the Yavam and the Yavama, there was no problem between the husband and the wife. Here, there's only a problem between the husband and the wife, right? And we are wondering whether that problem is going to torpedo the relationship between the Yavam and the Yavama as well, or not. Okay, so this is the Minchas Chinuch. I think we missed you for a second. So the Minchas Chinuch has a suffix whether the din of Tuma Ke'erva in our Gemara would say Yeharig Val Yavor for Sota, despite the fact that it is different. That's a very remarkable question. Okay, so
it's not a typical erva.
It's not a typical erva at all. And there's as I said, there's no kares, there's no Parshas Achrei Mos, there's no mamzer, there's tfisas kiddushin, it's the whole bit. But in addition to that, it's not a problem. It's not primarily a problem between Yavam and Yavama. It's a problem between Ish v'Ishto. That makes it totally different, like Maksu Grishasa. Okay. Tosfos here points out that there are two types of Sota. And if you look at the Mishnah in the beginning of Sota, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, the first Mishnah in Sota says that in a case of Yibum with a Sota, that there is Chalitza. Where does it say that? So if you look before we get to Tosfos, let's just look at our sheets for a moment. The sheets, look to page 1, 2, 3, 4, I would say 5. Page 4. You'll see Talmud Bavli, Sota, Beis Amud Aleph. This is the first Mishnah in Masechet Sota. What does the Mishnah say? Hamakana li'ishto, if a person warns his wife, he says, I suspect you of, betraying marriage, and, if you continue to, to clandestinely meet with Plony, these will be the consequences, etc. So there's no explicit evidence of witnesses here. It's a process. This is what we call the process of Sota, or suffix Sota. Hamakani le'ishto, Rabbi Elazar makani lo pishnayim, umashgal pi echad, al pi atmo, Rabbi Yeshua makani al pishnayim, umashgal pishnayim. Okay, we'll leave that for a moment. Ketzan makani lo, what are we talking about? Omerlai says to her, bifnei shnayim, in the presence of two people, al tidabri imish ploni. Don't, tidabri, sounds like, just a conversation, but obviously it means more than that. Vidibra imo, adayin he would teres lebesom, would teres lecho betruma, having a meeting with him, per se, because she's warned, does not trigger a different status. She can still eat truma, she can still live with him, etc. But if nichnasa ima lebeis haseser, if she is secrets herself away with him, she goes somewhere private with him, v'shasa imo kedei tuma, and they're in a discreet place, and possibly something took place violating the marital contract, asur lebesav asur lachol b'truma. Then she, even though we don't have certain proof, but he warned her not to, engage in this kind of behavior. We don't know definitively that anything, actually happened, but they were in a private place and something could have happened after this kinui. So the din is that asur lebesav asur lechol b'truma. Then the last line of the Mishnah is mace. Let's say he then dies, and like Andy said before, let's say there wasn't enough time, or he didn't divorce her, so she's still his wife by the time he dies, right? Maybe maybe this drove him to an early death. Who knows, right? The agmas nefesh or whatever in mace. So the din is choletzes v'lo misyavemes. So there's no yibum in that case, suffix sota, but there is chalitza. Oh, so that's the question. And our Gemara is going to ask that question. How come in our Gemara it says sota, even tzara sota, there's no yibum and no chalitza even for the tzara? And yet the Mishnah says in the beginning of sota that there is chalitza, even though there's no yibum. So that's what Tosas points out. If you look here at Tosas on Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, tzara sota asura, Tosas says lav dafka asura. The word asura is a little misleading. It sounds like you just, that you just can't do yibum. Ta'af michalitza ptura, right? There's an exclusion from chalitza as well, meaning there's no zika when she's a sota. It appears bekuntris. And then Tosas adds, the dafka sota vadai. This is true only of a sota vadai where there is evidence, meaning edus, that there really was a betrayal of the marriage contract. Aval sota safek, but where you go through the process of sota, namely the kinui and the stira, but we don't have absolute evidence that there was a physical betrayal of the marriage, boy chalitza, then you require a chalitza. How do we know this? Kedamaisi b'samuch, because of the Mishnah that's brought in a few minutes, which is the Mishnah that we just read, the first Mishnah in Masechet Sota. Ukra, Santosis is troubled because the pasuk that uses the language of tuma, which is the basis of treating sota as if it's an erva, even though it isn't an erva, with all the chidushim that we were discussing before, that pasuk seems to apply to the case of safek sota with kinu and stira, as well as sota vadai with edim. That's what Tosa says. Ukra divinister of he nitma'a. Right? Beniveles, what do you mean nistera? Nistera means technically it's translated as, vinistera, and she closeted herself, meaning she went, into a place privately with this fellow. It sounds like it's suffix sota. And it says that vihi nitma, that is, the equivalent of tuma. So that would imply that suffix sota, is also under the rubric of tuma. Ke'erva. Says Tosfos, no. The word vinistera there in the pasuk means benivala vadai. Iri. Kinemasik will come on. You'll see in a minute the Argamara in the Shalkavataria says that the Torah doesn't want to use graphic language. So it says vinistera, and the rest, is clear, even if it isn't explicit. Aval sota suffix, but if it's really a suffix, but it's this process of kinui, an actual stira, nothing else, lo kasaba tuma. Then we don't apply, we don't say it's tuma. It's suffix tuma, but it's not tuma, and therefore there is going to be chalitza, even though there's not going to be yibum. Says Tosas v'im tomer.
No yibum.
What?
Why will there be no?
So the Gemara in Sota discusses why there's no yibum, but you can understand why. Tosas is wondering why they even have that.
And does everything stay the same even in the time of the Beis Hamikdash when there was a Sota process?
Yes.
Would still
Just
be-
that there was a possibility of hashkas me sota, of drinking this special water, but otherwise the rest of the dinim are the same. So listen, this is what Tosa going to ask. Vim Tomar, but Tznan nichnasim ala beis haseser, asur lebesa ve'asur letruma. Darshin beperik kashem. The Gemara says in Sota shlosha pamim it says v'nitma. Ksiv echad the baal, echad the baal, ve'echad the truma. So it sounds like the language of Vinistra V'initma does refer to Safek Sota. Says Tosos, Shlomar, Dilo Osra Kosav Mishum Safek, Shema Nivala Benitma. It's true that we don't have, she's not a Sota Vadai, but the possibility that she is a Sota is something that we're machmir. Listen to the language. Olam lo ksiv betuma el alabadai nivala. So why is she, no longer able to live with him? That sounds like a din d'oraisa, and she can't eat truma. Why do you say it's a suffix? Says Tosos v'yeshlomar, the asa safek kivadai. This is a very important idea. The Gemara says that the suffix of a sota isn't a regular suffix; it's safek kivadai. Kid Amar beperik kashem. Im nitma lama shosa, im lo nitma lama nishkes, magad the chakasav shasafek asura kivadai. Allahaki safek sota boy chalitza. That's why in the Mishnah, in the beginning of sota, in the case of safek sota, you need chalitza. Why? Because it's still a safek. Because dafka lahachmir asa safek kivadai, but lo lahakel lapatra below chalitza. So Tosis develops here the principle, which is very important, and that is that safek sota is more than a regular suffix of Kol Torah Kula. Even a regular suffix in Kol Torah Kula, there's a very big debate. And as we usually
presumption of guilt here by suffix sota?
There's an assumption of guilt without a knowledge of guilt. But in the Balitosis understanding, unlike the Rambam, which we'll discuss next week, there's like a projection of guilt, of likely guilt. Tosis actually on Yud Aleph from the base, if you turn for a minute, the second Tosis suggests that there's even Malchus misafek, which is very remarkable, almost unheard of. My Nistra Nivala, Tosis says, the second Tosis, Bimtoma Kivin Delog Siv La Besota Safek, Amai Omar Besota Dim Balel Bala Baderech Loke. How could there be Malchus if it's only a Safek? How could you be Loke misafek? There are no Edim. Yeshloma de Lechumra Asa Kasuv Safek Kivad. Can appreciate that. The Rambam disagrees, and even Bali. If you look at Rabbi Kiva,
and it has a double problem because Malchus requires an action, and since it's a suffix, we don't know if there was an action.
Yeah. So the projection is that there's an action ad kedekach.
Unless the seclusion is the action itself.
So it doesn't seem that way. It seems like it's again the Rambam disagrees, and if you look at Rabbi Kiva, he points out that Tosis later on in Yevamos on Samach Tesam Aleph disagrees, and he doesn't mention, but it's also true that Tosis and Sota Chav Tesam Aleph disagrees. But this is a very expansive Tosis. So just to make it clear, we're going to stop in just a minute. But this question of suffix Sota is a very remarkable din. In general, suffix, we have rules of suffix, as we know, and we normally say Sfeika Doraisa is L'chumra. We have a biblical suffix; it's we're machmir, we're stringent. The Rambam doesn't think that's always true anyway. For the Rambam, often that's a rabbinic law, that Safek Doraisa L'chumra is only a din d'Rabbanan. But most Rishonim think Safek Doraisa L'chumra is a din d'Oraisa. But even if it's L'chumra, it's not Kavada. It's L'chumra as a Safek. You would never get Malchus, and you wouldn't say Asa Kavada. So Safek Sota, and the Gemara seems to say, is a special rule. And it's also the source. We have a rule in the halacha called Safek Tuma B'Rishus Hayachid Tameh, Safek Tuma B'Rishus Harabim Tahar. If there's a ritual impurity Safek, in general, so if the root of the Safek is B'Rishus Hayachid, in a private domain, we're machmirs. It's called Safek Tuma B'Rishus Hayachid Tameh. Safek Tuma B'Rishus Harabim is Tahar. So where does that come? Where would that come from? So there are two possibilities where it comes from, but one of the main possibilities is Sota. So the Balitosis actually in Sota asks this question. They say, because they thought, why is it that Sota is treated more than a regular Safek? even according to the Rambam, even more than the normal view of Safek l'chumra, because it's kivadai l'chumra. Why is that? So some of them suggest because when there's a kinui, right, and then there's a stira, there's raglayim l'davar, meaning if it's not just a Safek, maybe she betrayed him. He warned her, he said, I'm going to consider this a betrayal, if you continue to be involved and to be seen with, and then not to be seen with, Plony. So if she defies that, and she's, Nistar with Plony after being warned, so some of the Bali Tosa says, Raglayim Ladavar, that something is going on, that obviously it gives greater credence to the possibility that something.
Yeah, but there have to be Adam that saw her.
No Adam. Oh, that Adam. There's Adam on the kinui, but there's and maybe Adam on the stira, but there's no Adam that anything happened. So what's fascinating is the Bali Tos, some of the Achronim.
So there's no Adam. So how do we know that that's true?
Right. So that's the special din of Safek Sota that I saw Kavadai.
No,
but it's not a Saw Kavadai that there's no Chalitza, like a real Adam. It's still different, but it's a higher level than most.
There are Adam on the seclusion, is there not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's already
no, but that's not. It's not Hanedi Yichud Hanedi Bia. It's just that just
No, but the seclusion itself gives the Raglayim L'Davar.
Right. So this is what some of the Rishonim and Achronim ask. They say, how can this be a source for Safek Tumah B'Rishus Hayachid Tameh? Here at least there's Raglayim L'Davar. But in a typical, you have, I don't know, sheretz, and you're not sure whether the sheretz, came in contact with the kudshim, so we say, B'Rishus Hayachid, it's Tameh because it's patterned after Sota. In Sota, there's Raglayim L'Davar. Here it's, so this is a very big problem, very big issue. Anyway, the point is that the Bali, this is what Reb Chaim explains, that the Bali Tosis really thought that Safek Sota, is such, we treat it all, as if it happened. His argument, we'll see, based on the Rambam's Psak and Ibum, is that the Rambam has a little bit of a different idea. The Rambam thinks that the process, I'll just leave you with this idea for now, we'll continue next week. The process of Kinu Yustira in Safek Sota is Mechayev and Oser in its own right. It's kind of what you were hinting at before, meaning he told her not to do this, and she did it. So in a way, that's kind of the betrayal in its own right, even if nothing happened. Now, if we know nothing happened, we'll say it this way: the Safek that something might have happened, and the Vadai, that either way she was, rebellious or defiant or acting improperly after having been put on notice. The combination of not knowing and what she already certainly did do, which is give the impression, that she didn't care, about this sensibility. That is, that's a special din in Safek Sota, Kivadai. That's how Reb Chaim understands the Ram. I'll try to show that, next week. But either way, what emerges here is something very fast. So I want to leave you with just one idea before we part for today, and then we'll pick up with this next week. So what I've been trying to show is that this Gemara is a very remarkable Gemara, and that's why Tosas is struggling about Safek Sota, because if the language of Tumah applies to Safek Sota, and it's Ke'erva, then Safek Sota also should be no Chalitza and Tzara and the whole bit, but it's not. But as we discussed, even Vadai Sota, it's remarkable that Tuma makes it Ke'erva, and the Minchas Chinu could wonder about your Horeg Vayavar. But forget about that. What does that have to do with Yibum? All cases of Yibum, except for Masa Grushaso and Sota, are problems that exist objectively, halachically, between the Yavam and the Yavama, not leftover problems from the mace. But I think the answer, again, in light of everything we've been doing all year, is very simple. And that is, what's the whole idea of Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav? It's all about Kedusha. We want to make sure, when she marries, her husband, and she marries into a family. And, this high standard of Kedusha, dictates, that even a very difficult course, like, shifting gear from being, the wife of his brother to somebody who he's going to, create a marriage with for the sake of lahakim la'achiv shame, but you're going to have that kind of a required, mandated legacy and as a davar shebekdusha when the relationship between the husband and the wife themselves was completely, suffused with
Correct.
tumult. You know what I'm saying? So that's the point. It's true. And the same with Masu Gushasa, even more in Sota, but on another level, Masu Gushasa too. It's true that these are cases where the problem, is in the first marriage, not in the potential second marriage. But the whole point is, that
incompatible situation.
Are you going to create a yibum, a heter of Eisha Sach to create a legacy for a marriage that was Makulkal? That was
The action is
Talmud?
incompatible with the goal.
It's incompatible with the goal, 100%. Again, it would still be good for him to have an heir in the world. But what we've been trying to show all along is, at least according to many Rishonim, it isn't just about an heir. It's about the sanctity of the marriage and family and continuity and so on. But now with this wife, and it's such a tumma. His wife, his marriage that we're trying to kind of continue.
It's exactly opposite. It's like the shore on this skull when it does something or something.
It's not a bad
that one of the reasons is we don't want that thing walking around, people saying, "Oh, that's
right."
So the
right.
same thing with this marriage. Everybody will say,
Right. So I'm going to try to show you next week that some of the Gemaras about, first of all, we'll discuss the Ravid's view and the Ra'ah's view. They think that there is Chalitza, and the Ra'ah thinks there even would be Ibum be a Rishona, and yet there's still a P'tur Tzar. I want to talk about that. But I also want to go through the Gemaras in the beginning of Sota, where the Gemara kind of says a lot of this, about Safek Sota even, why there's no Yibum. They say, like, you're going to force Yibum, or you're going to have Yibum in the case where the marriage itself was falling apart, or supposed to fall apart. Is that subject to Yibum? Even Safek, so there might be, then the Gemara says, so maybe you shouldn't need Chalitza either. So we'll discuss it, but it fits in very beautifully with our bigger theme, which is, in a way, this is the opposite of the opposite parallel of some of these other cases, because you have all of the unacceptable relationship part because of the kilkul of the first marriage, without the surim of even implementing the yibum, because you just would say normally ase do kalos ase. There's no kares. It's not even ase v'lav. It's a problem with the brothers, man, not his problem. But what are you trying to save here? What legacy are you trying to preserve? You're trying to preserve a failed marriage, not just a failed marriage on an objective level, a marriage where the kedusha of the marriage was totally shattered. I think that's the point. All right. Anyways, we'll stop here, and Mitzvah Hashem will continue next week.
good night.
Okay. Shkach, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Night.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night.